There is a particular kind of loss that has no name. It is not the kind that screams. It does not arrive with a dramatic moment. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no single sentence you can point to and say, "There, that is where everything broke." It comes quietly, the way cold air comes in under a door. Slowly, steadily, until the whole room has changed temperature and you cannot quite remember what warmth felt like. It arrives in small things. In the way a man's eyes slide past you the moment someone else walks into the room. In the way his voice softens, just slightly, just enough. In a way it never quite softened for you. In the way you smile and nod and say, "I understand," while every quiet part of you is coming apart at the seams. Celine Dornmer knew this kind of loss, or she had known it without a name for it for 6 years. 6 years of pouring herself into a man, into a pack, into a stretch of highland pine forest that she had come to love the way you love something you built with your own 2 hands. She had not been born into Ironvale. She had earned it, stone by stone, contract by contract, early morning by early morning. She was not Alpha Aldrich Coldridge's fated mate. The moon goddess had never written their names beside each other in the old laws. There had been no golden pull between their chests, no moment of shaking recognition, no celestial confirmation that she was meant to be there. What there had been was choice. Every single morning, she chose him. She chose the pack. She told herself that a love freely chosen, given deliberately and completely, on every day, was worth more than a love that was simply handed to you by fate. She almost believed it. She stood now at the back of the grand hall in a simple black dress. The drums had begun. The elders had risen from their carved stone chairs along the altar wall. Ceremonial candles burned in long rows on both sides, and their light made everything look like a painting, golden and distant and slightly unreal. Celine had already spoken her severance words. 6 years of her life, reduced to 2 ritual sentences, delivered in a clear and steady voice while 200 wolves watched in silence. She was supposed to feel relieved. She had told herself that much, at least. Walk in. Speak the words. Walk out. Leave clean. You will be all right. You have always found a way to be all right. She felt nothing at all. Not grief. Not anger. Only a deep, still emptiness. The way a room feels after all the furniture has been moved out. The same walls, the same floor, but all the living gone from it. Elder Leoric Holloway reached for the ceremonial silver blade on the altar table. His hands were steady. His eyes moved briefly to Celine's, and in them she saw something she was not ready to name. A quiet guilt, and a helpless apology, and the sadness of a man who had seen this coming long before anyone else admitted the possibility. The drums built, louder, heavier. Soraya Emberley, radiant in white silk at the front of the altar, extended her hand. The moment stretched, and stretched, and stretched. And then the doors came down, not opened, not pushed aside. Down. Both iron-banded panels tearing from their stone hinges with a sound like the world splitting. They striking the floor of the grand hall with a crash that shook the candles in their holders and sent a tremor through every wolf in the room. Through the settling dust and the shocked silence, a single figure stepped forward, and the entire temperature of the hall changed. To understand what Celine lost, you first have to understand what she built. Go back 3 years. Not to the beginning, but to the middle. The place where most real love stories live, without ever admitting it. The place where the first spark has settled into something quieter and steadier, where what you are left with is the daily, ordinary, unglamorous work of choosing to remain. It is a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The sun is not yet up. The Iron Vale pack house is dark and still, every wolf sleeping, or the whole Highland Valley folded into that particular hush that belongs only to 4 in the morning, the hour between night and dawn, when the world holds its breath. Celine Dornmere is already at her desk. The administrative office smells of pine resin and old paper, and the faint trace of coffee she brewed more than an hour ago. Maps of the Northern Highland Territory are pinned across the left wall in careful order. 3 stacks of files sit on the desk, each labelled in her precise, unhurried handwriting. 1 for active contracts, 1 for pending renewals, 1 for expired filings to be archived. She is cross-referencing a billing schedule against a contract renewal deadline, and she has been doing this for 90 minutes in complete silence, of the only sound the soft scratch of her pen and the occasional settling of the old stone walls around her. She finds the error at 11 minutes to 5. It is buried in a footnote, a rounding discrepancy in a quarterly timber yield report, compounding unnoticed across 18 months of filings, small enough to have been missed by anyone who was not paying attention with both eyes and all their patience, large enough, left uncorrected, to have given the Highland Authority legitimate grounds to reject Iron Vale's primary land management contract renewal in the spring. A rejected renewal would have meant the loss of 60% of the pack's annual operating revenue. It would have meant laying off the 2 full-time border patrol crews. It would have meant the medical supply contract ending, which would have meant old Brenner Greystone collecting his own heart medication, or not collecting it at all. She corrects the error. She files the corrected report. She makes a note in the review log. Checked and amended. TY filing. Q3. She does not alert anyone. There is no need. The problem is solved, and the pack will never know it existed, and that is exactly how she prefers it. This was Celine Dornmere, not warm in the way people expect warmth to look. She did not offer soft words when things felt difficult, did not fill rooms with easy reassurance, did not bend herself into comfortable shapes to make others feel at ease. She showed care through competence. She showed love through work. She protected the people she had chosen by making sure the ground beneath their feet was solid. And she did it in quiet. And she did it without waiting for anyone to notice, because noticing was never the point. The point was that it got done. She had come to Aldrich Coldridge at 23. He had been 26 then, and he had been drowning. His father, the previous Alpha of Iron Vale, had been a man of large ambitions and ruinous decisions. He had sold portions of the pack's Highland Territory over a decade to fund development projects that never materialized. He had signed agreements he did not fully understand with regional authorities who understood them very well. He had borrowed against future contracts that he then failed to deliver on, and he had died leaving his pack with less than 40% of their original territory, a debt load that 3 separate financial advisors had quietly called unrecoverable, and a fractured, defrightened community that was running on loyalty alone. Aldrich had inherited all of it. The title, the debt, the stripped territory, the frightened pack, the grief, especially the grief, for a father who had loved the pack and still broken it, for a future that felt like it was collapsing before it had properly started, for the weight of being responsible for people who trusted you and having no clear idea how to carry it. She had walked into his office on a cold November morning with a revised financial plan she had spent 2 weeks building, from nothing but access to the pack's records and her own relentless, organized intelligence. She did not apologize for its directness. She did not soften the numbers or arrange them in a kinder order. She set the plan on the desk in front of him and told him plainly what it would take, in what order, and why. He looked at her for a long moment, then at the plan, then at her again. "How long?" he said. 3 years to solvency, she said. 5 to genuine stability, 7 to real strength, if you do not repeat the patterns that put you here. He flinched. She did not apologize for that either. You can do this. I already started, she said. She had. In those 2 weeks before their first meeting, she had already made the first calls, identifying which contracts could be renegotiated, which needed to be cleanly ended, which Highland Authority liaisons were known for working constructively with struggling land operations. She had found 2 board members on a regional conservation committee who would respond well to a properly framed, sustainable forestry pitch. She had mapped out the first 6 months of action steps in order of urgency. She had walked in with not just the plan, but the first chapter of its execution already underway, because waiting for permission to begin solving a problem had never been how she operated. Aldrich hired her before she left the office. The years that followed were years of real work, and she loved them in the particular way that people who are built for purpose love the thing that finally gives them space to use it. She renegotiated the land contracts. She restructured the pack's debt across a manageable timeline. She identified a retired pack medic to come once a week to the pack house and check on the older wolves, among them Brenner Greystone, a broad-shouldered man in his early 70s who had been Iron Vale's head border patrol soldier for 30 years and who now needed his heart medication collected from the village pharmacy every Thursday. He had never once asked her directly. She had simply noticed, in the way she noticed everything, and arranged it. Every Friday morning afterward, a small clay pot of mountain honey appeared on the office doorstep. No note, no explanation, just honey. She organized the first successful winter harvest Iron Vale had seen in 11 years. She established a schooling coordinator for the pack's children, and then spent 3 months of quiet, the persistent negotiation with the Highland Municipal Authority to have those children registered in the regional education system, which mattered for their futures in ways that most of the pack had stopped expecting to think about. She did not do these things for credit. She did them because the pack needed them done. And she was there, and she knew how. What grew between her and Aldrich over those years was not the kind of love that announces itself. It was the other kind, the kind built slowly, from shared late nights, and the particular closeness that comes from 2 people seeing each other at their worst and choosing to remain. Built from small accumulated moments, from Aldrich bringing her coffee at 10 in the evening when he found her still working, or from Celine straightening the notes on his desk before a summit because she knew the way his mind worked and the order in which he needed information. From years of waking up in the same building and going to sleep, knowing the other person was still there. One night, about 2 years in, they had spread new Highland Authority contract maps across the entire desk, and Aldrich had been awake since 5 that morning. Somewhere around midnight, mid-sentence, his head drooped, and he fell asleep in his chair. Celine looked at him for a moment. Something in her chest did a slow, careful thing that she chose not to examine. She rose from her chair. She took her own jacket from its hook and laid it over him, very gently, without waking him. She sat back down. She finished the survey reconciliation. She left the completed work on his side of the desk and went to bed at 2 in the morning, and did not tell him about it the next day. But she thought about it later, in the quiet hours before dawn, when her mind was most honest with her. She thought about the particular quality of caring for someone who did not quite know the full shape of how much. She asked herself whether it was enough, whether choosing someone thoroughly and completely every single day counted for anything if they didn't fully feel the weight of being chosen. She told herself it was enough. She almost believed it. The one thing she didn't speak about, not to Islin Briarwell, who was the closest thing she had to a true friend in the pack, not to Elder Leoric, not to anyone, was the absence at the center of her own chest. No mate bond had ever stirred in her. What the moon goddess had given her no sign, no pull, no recognition, no warmth rising in her wolf's blood at the approach of any particular person. She was 29 years old, and that particular silence in her had never once been broken. She had told herself for years that it did not matter, that chosen love was as real and as valid as fated love, that what she and Aldrich had was built on something solid, and solid things did not require a celestial endorsement to hold. She almost believed this too. And then Aldrich came home from the northern summit. It was a Friday in late September, just before sunset. She was on the front steps with delivery receipts for new medical equipment she had ordered for the healer's cottage. She heard the vehicles on the gravel drive. She looked up. Aldrich stepped out first. He looked good. He always looked good after summits. The travel agreed with him. He was already smiling, that quiet, settled smile that meant negotiations had gone well. And beside him, stepping from the passenger side with her fingers loosely woven through his, was a woman Celine had never seen. She was young, 22, perhaps, beautiful in the effortless way that seems almost unfair. Dark eyes, dark hair, an ease to her movements that came from a lifetime of being watched and finding it comfortable rather than exposing. She looked up at the pack house with the mild, interested curiosity of someone taking in a new place that would very soon become familiar. Aldrich's shoulder was turned toward her. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to someone who did not know him well. Just slightly. An unconscious adjustment of his entire body, or the way a plant angles without being instructed, toward light. Celine's wolf understood before her mind caught up. The sensation was not a stab of pain. It was slower than that. It was the moment you become aware that the floor you have been standing on has been tilting, slowly, invisibly, over a long time. And it has now tilted just far enough that you cannot pretend anymore that it is level. She set the delivery receipts down on the step. She stood up, and she stepped back to let them in. Elder Leoric appeared at her shoulder a moment later. He stood beside her in the doorway without speaking. He looked at Aldrich. He looked at the woman beside Aldrich. He looked at Celine's face. He was quiet for a moment. "Spine of this pack," he said, very softly, to no one in particular. He went inside without another word. Celine stood in the doorway until Aldrich reached the steps, and then she did what she had always done when something needed to be held together. She lifted her chin. She composed her face. She met him at the door. "Welcome home," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She did not cry that night. She sat in the small bathroom of her private quarters at 2 a.m. She ran cold water over her wrists. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, 4 counts each, the way she had taught herself to do in difficult moments over years of having no one to hand difficult moments to. Then she looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Not with self-pity, not with drama, just steadily, the way you take honest stock after an unexpected fall, checking what is genuinely broken, what only hurts, what is still standing. What looked back at her was a woman who was not going to come apart in the dark. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She went to make breakfast for the pack. This was how Celine had always managed hard things. Function first. Feel later, in small private pieces, in the spaces where it did not cost anyone else anything. She had never thought of this as a particular kind of strength. It was simply the only shape she knew how to be in. Aldrich gathered the senior pack members that morning in the main hall. Celine stood to one side with a coffee she barely tasted. He told them clearly, and with the careful gentleness of a man delivering news that he knows will hurt someone, and cannot find a way to change, that the moon goddess had given him his fated mate. Her name was Soraya Emberley. She came from a respected lowland pack to the south. The bond was real and confirmed. He hoped the pack would welcome her with open hearts. He did not look at Selene when he said it. He held his gaze above the assembled wolves, focused on some neutral point that let him say the words without having to witness their landing. Around the room, reactions were complicated. Joy. A fated Luna was a sacred blessing, a sign of divine favor for the pack, something to be celebrated. But eyes moved, briefly, carefully, with varying degrees of discretion, to Selene, to the woman standing very still beside the window, with an expression of complete composure that no one who knew her was fooled by for a second. Islin Briarwell, across the hall, caught Selene's eye. She did not try to offer a reassuring smile. She simply held her gaze, steady, present, asking nothing. Selene gave the smallest nod. I am fine. She was not fine. But she would be, eventually, and until then, she would not let anyone see her be anything but steady, because steadiness was what this transition required, and need had always been the thing that kept her upright when nothing else did. Soraya moved into the pack house 2 days later. She was not cruel. Selene needed to be precise about that, even in her own private accounting of things, because cruelty would have been simpler, easier to hold at a clean distance, easier to walk away from without looking back. Soraya Emberley was not cruel. She was simply careless. Careless in the specific way that belongs to people who have never had to earn a room's respect, who have never walked into a situation that did not already soften to accommodate them. As she moved through the pack house, with the pleasant, half-distracted energy of someone redecorating a hotel suite they were pleasantly surprised to be staying in. She rearranged the common room furniture, moving the deep, cushioned, weather-resistant pieces Selene had spent weeks sourcing from a Highland supplier who knew what cold winters actually required, replacing them with pale upholstered chairs from a capital city catalogue that would show every mark of use within a season. She changed the pack kitchen's meal schedule on 2 separate mornings because she found the timing inconvenient. She wandered into the administrative office twice without knocking, looked at the organized bookshelves and labeled filing systems with a kind of mild, uncomprehending surprise, and left both times without touching anything. She asked Selene, once, to explain the household finances. Selene sat with her for 45 minutes. She walked through every line item in the operating budget, every quarterly review structure, every emergency reserve. She explained the medical supply contract and its seasonal contingencies. She explained the Eastern Border Patrol incentive rotation and why the shifts were designed the way they were. She explained the reasoning behind the drainage system on the healer's cottage path, the timber yield reporting structure, the land maintenance scheduling tied to the Highland Authority renewal calendar. Soraya listened for about 4 minutes. She was not rude about it. She simply nodded at intervals with an expression of polite, wandering attention, and then said, with a bright and entirely genuine smile, that she would get to it properly later. She never did. Aldrich called Selene into the office on the 3rd day. She had known it was coming. She walked in, sat down across the desk from him, her desk, with her labeled binders on the shelf, her handwriting in the margins of the contract folders, her careful organization visible in every corner of the room, and she waited. He was struggling with how to say it. His eyes kept drifting to the window, as though the pine trees outside held some more comfortable version of the conversation he needed to have. He told her she was irreplaceable. He told her she was the backbone of everything Iron Vale had built over the past 6 years. He said that no one in the pack could adequately describe what she had contributed or what she meant to the territory. He said all of this with genuine warmth in his voice, What, as though being told your worth in a paragraph before being gently removed from everything you had built was a form of honor. And then he asked her to stay on, as an advisor, a support to Soraya as she settled into her role, a bridge between what the pack had been and what it was becoming. He said it carefully. He meant it kindly. He was not a bad man, and she understood that. He was simply a man who had held the nearest steady thing for 6 years, without ever fully reckoning with the reality that steady things have a person behind them, and that people can only be taken for granted so long before something quiet and irreversible changes in them. She listened to every word of the speech. She waited until he was finished. Then she folded her hands on the desk, her desk, and said, without raising her voice, "No." He looked startled, as though this answer had not seriously occurred to him. "I will attend the ceremony," she said. "I will make sure the transition is handled properly, because I love this pack, and I will not leave them in disorder. But I will not stay on as a tutor or a support system. I am not a bridge for someone else to walk across into the life I built here. When the ceremony is done, I leave." A silence, long enough to fill the whole room. "Celine." "I am not angry," she said. This was almost entirely true. "I am not trying to make this difficult. I am simply telling you what I will do and what I will not do. That is what I have always done." She stood. She straightened the hem of her jacket. She looked at him one last time across the desk she had sat at for 6 years, and something moved through her eyes that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but something older and quieter than either of those. "I hope Soraya makes you happy," she said. She walked out. The 2 weeks that followed were the quietest kind of terrible. Soraya continued her cheerful redecorating. The pale chairs arrived. The decorative garden feature was started on the healer's cottage path, a project that required partially removing the drainage channels Celine had installed 3 years ago, which would cause flooding issues in spring, but that detail did not surface until much later. Or new curtains were ordered for the pack meeting room in a shade that looked beautiful in a catalogue and turned out to be nearly impenetrable in the low northern light of an autumn afternoon. Aldrich watched all of it, with the particular blindness of a man whose entire perceptual system has been reorganized around a single person. The bond pulled his attention like gravity. He did not mean to be absent from the rest of the world. He was simply no longer fully in it. Old Brenner Greystone caught Celine on the path one morning, his honeypot in hand, making his weekly delivery to the office doorstep. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the half-demolished drainage channel beside the path. He was quiet for a moment. "She seems cheerful," he said at last. "Yes," Celine said. "Heart's in the right place, what I'd say." "I expect so." He pressed the honeypot into her hands. His palm rested over her knuckles for just a moment. Warm and unhurried, the way old hands hold things they know might not stay. "Spine of this pack," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away. Celine stood on the muddy path with the honeypot and the grey morning sky and the sound of the pines shifting in the wind, and she breathed until the tightness in her chest became small enough to carry. Then she went inside and finished the last of the contract reviews she had been working through since the morning. There were things she needed to complete before she left. Reports to close, schedules to leave in clear order, the green binder on the 3rd shelf, the one with the Eastern Border Patrol rotation, the seasonal variation notes, and the emergency contact chain needed updating with the new shift times she had worked out in August. She wrote careful notes throughout its margins. "Do not change the winter rotation. The younger wolves push past safe limits in the cold. The current schedule compensates for this. Trust it." She did not know who would read the notes. She wrote them anyway. The night before the ceremony, she stood in the small guest room she had been quietly moved to. The Luna's suite had been prepared for Soraya, which was correct, and Celine had relocated herself without being asked, which was how she had always operated. And she looked through the small box of personal items from her desk. There was very little. A silver pen that had been her grandmother's. A photograph from the morning of the first successful winter harvest. The whole pack assembled in the snow with the dazed, incredulous relief of people who had genuinely not been sure they would make it. She was in the back row, barely visible, wearing a smile she had not entirely intended to make. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a fold of paper, was a single dried sprig of ironwood blossom. From the tree she and Aldrich had planted in the pack courtyard on the morning after their first Highland Authority contract signing. He had suggested it, spontaneously and slightly awkwardly, the way he sometimes suggested things he cared about, but was not sure he should. She had gone to the nursery herself, and come back with the sapling. They had knelt in the cold spring soil and planted it together, neither of them saying much. Or she had thought, standing up afterward with dirt on her hands and the pale early sun coming through the pines, that this was the kind of morning she wanted more of. She held the sprig for a moment, just a moment. Then she set it in the wastebasket beside the desk, not with anger, not with tears, just gently, deliberately, the way you close a book at the last page, not because you did not love it, but because it is finished. She smoothed her black dress. She set her alarm. She had 8 hours. She went to sleep. The grand hall of Iron Vale Pack House had been built 2 generations ago by wolves who understood that sacred spaces required weight. Stone floors, 2 feet thick. Walls quarried from the same highland rock as the territory itself. Narrow windows set high so that the light that entered was always angled, always golden, but always slightly otherworldly. The carved Iron Vale crest on the eastern wall, an ironwood tree, roots deep, branches wide, had been cut by hand. Every wolf who had ever stood in this room for a ceremony of any significance had felt the accumulated presence of everyone who had stood here before them. It was a room built to hold important things. Celine stood at the far left wall, near the last carved bench, and looked at it one final time. Soraya had added white silk ribbons and silver lanterns along the ceremony aisle. They were beautiful. They were also completely wrong for this room. Too light, too decorative, too much like a celebration at a summer party, and not enough like the ancient, binding thing that a lunar succession ceremony actually was. Celine looked at the ribbons, and then looked at the stone walls behind them and thought, but quietly, I built this room. I know every crack in it. I know which torch bracket was replaced 3 years ago, because the iron had rusted through, and I know which flagstone on the left side dips slightly in wet weather and needs sand underneath it to stay level. She did not say this to anyone. She simply looked at it and remembered it, and let that be enough. Islin Briarwell stood beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched. She had arrived without announcement and taken her place beside Celine with the quiet, deliberate solidarity of someone making a choice. She had not said anything. There was nothing useful to say, and Islin had always understood the difference between words that help and words that only fill silence. After a moment, she reached over and pressed Celine's hand once, brief and firm. Celine pressed back. Then they both stood straight. The hall filled quickly. Every wolf in the territory had come. They lined the walls, filled the benches, stood packed at the back, because pack ceremonies are rare and significant, and no wolf with healthy instincts stays away from a moment when the invisible bonds of leadership are made permanent and visible. The collective breath of 200 wolves made the air warm despite the stone's chill. The scents layered over each other. Pine resin from outdoor jackets, candle smoke, cold rock and drifting from the altar, faint and sweet and slightly out of place in this old space, the vanilla fragrance of Soraya's perfume. The 3 drum carriers took their position at the far end of the hall. Their rhythm was slow and deep, each beat landing in the chest cavity like a second pulse, steady and inexorable, or the physical reminder that this moment was coming whether you were ready or not. The grey-robed elders filed in and took their places along the altar. Elder Leoric stood at the center. His face was composed. His hands were clasped. He was as steady as the stone he stood on, because he had been at the center of more pack ceremonies than anyone else in the territory, and he knew how to carry the weight of them. But when his eyes found Selene at the back of the hall, something passed through his expression that had no official place in a lunar succession ceremony. It lasted only a moment. Then he sealed it away behind the practiced composure of a man who knew his role and would not allow his private grief to interfere with it. Aldrich entered from the side passage. Or the hall adjusted, that collective shift of attention that happens when an alpha enters a room full of his own wolves, like a compass needle swinging north. He was formally dressed in charcoal and deep iron veil green, the territory crest at his collar. His shoulders were level. His expression carried the measured gravity he wore for significant moments. Selene looked at him from the back of the hall. She waited for the familiar ache, the one that had lived somewhere behind her sternum for most of 6 years, and found it quieter than she expected. Not absent, perhaps not ever fully absent, but dimmed, like a lamp turned low rather than extinguished, the shape still there but the heat of it reduced, a bruise past its worst point, already weeks into healing whether she had wanted it to or not, or she watched him the way you watch a familiar place you are leaving for the last time. Not with the desperate attention of grief, but with the steady, memorizing gaze of someone who wants to know they have kept the shape of it. Just the shape. Then Soraya came down the aisle. She was luminous. There was no other honest word for it. The ceremonial lights caught the white silk in a way that made it almost glow. She moved with grace, unhurried, her dark eyes warm and bright and fixed forward toward the altar, toward Aldrich. The pack watched her with the particular collective attention reserved for beautiful things that arrive like gifts, unexpectedly and completely. Selene watched Aldrich's face when Soraya reached him. She watched him look at Soraya the way she had spent 6 years quietly hoping, in a part of herself she rarely admitted to, or that he might one day look at her. There was something almost peaceful about it, in the end, like finally having a question answered, a question you had been carrying so long that part of you had stopped expecting it would ever be resolved. The answer was not the one she had wanted, but it was clear, and clarity, in its own quiet way, was a kind of mercy. She tucked the observation somewhere small and private, and she closed the door on it. Elder Leoric began the formal invocation. His voice filled the hall completely, old words, deep and carrying, the language of a lunar succession ceremony that had not changed in 3 generations. The words spoke of the moon goddess's will, of the sacred bond between an alpha and the one chosen to stand beside him, of the responsibilities of leadership and the continuity of the pack's future. Not every wolf in the room stood straighter as the words landed. The invocation reached its midpoint, the severance clause, the formal releasing of all former bonds and ties that cleared the way for the new Luna to take her place without conflict or residual claim. Leoric's eyes moved to the back of the hall. "Selene Dawnmare," he said. The hall went silent, not the ordinary silence of a pause, a deeper silence, sudden and complete, as though the room itself was holding its breath. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the back wall. Islin's hand found hers again, squeezed once, then let go. Selene took a breath. She lifted her chin. She began the walk down the center aisle. 200 wolves watched her, and not one of them made a sound. The candlelight moved against the stone walls, while the silk ribbons caught small currents of air and shifted. Her footsteps were quiet on the old flagstones. She did not look at Soraya's expression. She had no interest in what was on it. She did not look at Aldrich's guilty one. She looked forward, at the altar, at Elder Leoric's steady face, at the ceremony she was here to complete because she had promised the pack a graceful transition, and she intended to honor that promise even now. She reached the altar. She spoke the severance words. Her voice did not waver once, not on a syllable. 6 years of her life, and she gave the words the same quality she had always given important things. Careful, clear, completely present. A long silence when she finished, as though the hall needed a moment to absorb what had just happened. Then Elder Leoric reached for the ceremonial silver blade, or the drum's bilt. The sound filled the room from the floor upward. Soraya extended her hand toward the altar, palm upward, to receive the blessing that would seal her as Luna. The moment stretched, and the doors came off the wall. The crash was enormous, not just loud, but physical, a concussive wave of sound that moved through every body in the room at once. Both iron-banded panels struck the stone floor simultaneously, and the impact shook the candles in their stands, and the reverberation rolled up the walls and across the ceiling and came back down changed, carrying with it a new quality of air, cold and sharp, and carrying a weight that was not temperature, an aura. It hit the hall like a tide coming in, dense, ancient, pressing. Not painful, but inescapable. The kind of authority that does not ask for submission and receives it anyway, because the body understands things the mind is still working out. Around the hall, every wolf went to their knees. Not because they chose to, because their instincts moved faster than their will. Aldrich's legs buckled. He caught himself on the altar table, gripping its edge with both hands, his face pale and stunned. Soraya crumpled into the folds of her white silk gown with a small, frightened sound. The elders folded slowly. The pack members nearest the doors went down like a wave moving forward. Celine didn't kneel. She stood exactly as she had been standing, spine straight, chin level, feet planted. And she searched her own body for the reason, because she was as surprised as anyone. It was not defiance. It was not resistance. It was that when the aura reached her, it did not press. It settled. It moved around her and through her like the first clean air after a long time indoors. And her wolf, quiet and bruised and still for weeks, lifted her head. Through the dust that had risen from the fallen doors, a figure stepped forward. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed without ceremony in a charcoal suit that carried itself with the ease of someone who was never not the most powerful presence in any space he occupied. Dark hair, a face that was set in controlled fury, not explosive, not loud, but the contained, focused kind that is more frightening than noise because it is aimed. His eyes were a rare storm grey, and they found Celine across the entire length of the hall before they found anything else. Before the altar was before Aldrich, still gripping the table's edge, before the 200 kneeling wolves, before any other detail of the room. They found her first, and they did not move. He began to walk toward her. The kneeling wolves shifted on either side without being asked, making a clear path down the center of the aisle. He walked through them unhurried, his gaze fixed forward until he reached the altar. And then he walked past the altar, past Aldrich and Soraya, and the silver blade, and the green cloth and all the ceremony of it, until he was standing in front of her. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment. Really looked, the way people rarely allow themselves to look at someone when there are 200 witnesses, and something in the controlled fury on his face shifted. Not disappeared, but moved aside, just slightly, or to make room for something else. He reached out, carefully, and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. The gesture was so quiet, so precisely gentle, that it stood in complete contrast to the destroyed doors and the kneeling hall, and the weight of the aura still pressing against every surface in the room. Then he leaned forward, just enough, and spoke in a voice low enough that only she could hear it. "I felt the moment you decided you were not worth fighting for," he said, "and I got on a plane." Celine looked at him. She said nothing, but something shifted in her chest, very slightly, like a window cracking open. And her wolf, who had been still for weeks, took one slow step toward the warmth. Halric Thornfield, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, turned to face the hall. He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. Or the authority in his tone was the quiet kind, the kind that does not require volume, because it is already in the room before he speaks, filling it from floor to ceiling, pressing into every corner. When a man of that kind speaks at normal volume, the effect is more complete than shouting. "The severance words have been spoken," he said. "By pack law and by the will of the elders, Celine Dawnmere's ties to Ironvale are formally dissolved as of this moment." The hall remained utterly still, 200 wolves kneeling on stone, breathing carefully. "She is free," he said, "of obligation, of contract, of claim." He paused for just a beat, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite amusement, but a shadow of it, sharp-edged. "Which means that the ceremony you were in the middle of conducting has, in its own thoroughness, released the most capable woman on the northern coast from all formal ties. I am here to extend a different invitation." From the altar, Aldrich found his feet. His wolf was pushing back. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the tension along his shoulders. The fated bond with Soraya was real and it was strong, but his wolf's pride was older than the bond, and it was reacting now with the instinct that belongs to any alpha watching his territory be addressed by a superior power. He pushed himself upright. His hands were not entirely steady, but his voice, when it came, was. "Celine is part of this pack," Aldrich said. Halric looked at him. Just looked. It was not a threatening look. It was not a challenging look. It was simply the gaze of a mountain, responding to the observation that a stone nearby has shifted, acknowledging the fact with the complete, indifferent steadiness of something that will not be moved by it. Aldrich's wolf went quiet. Aldrich sat back down on the edge of the altar table. He sat down and he said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say. And somewhere beneath the pride and the bond and the stunned silence of the moment, he knew it. Halric turned back to Celine. Here the authority dropped away. Not entirely. It was part of him the way height was part of him, inseparable from the structure of the thing. But the directed focus of it changed. He was not looking at the hall anymore. He was looking at her. He held out his arm. Not commanded. Offered. The difference was precise and deliberate, and she understood it immediately. It was in the angle of his elbow, the openness of his expression, the absence of expectation in his eyes. He was genuinely prepared to accept whichever answer she gave. Celine looked around the hall. She looked at the 200 wolves still on their knees on the stone floor. She looked at Aldrich on the altar, his face carrying the complicated expression of a man who was beginning, in real time, to understand the full weight of what he had let go. She looked at the silk ribbon strung across the room's old walls, and the silver lanterns, and all the ceremony of the life she had built, being dressed in someone else's preferences. She looked at Islin Briarwell at the back of the hall, on her knees like everyone else, her dark eyes bright and wet, to watching Celine with an expression that held no instructions, only hope. She looked at Brenner Greystone, kneeling near the side wall with his broad, weathered hands pressed together in front of him. His expression held a helpless apology that he could not have put into words. She thought, Thursday. Someone needs to remember Thursday. The pharmacy doesn't hold the order past closing. She looked at Elder Leoric, who stood at his full height, his grey robes perfectly still, his face composed into the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular moment and intended to observe every detail of it. Then she looked at Halric Thornfield, storm-grey eyes, the fury banked to something steadier, that particular quiet that was not empty, but full of something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized in the way you sometimes recognize a piece of music you have never heard before, and understand, in your bones, is meant for you. She reached out. She took his arm. The aura in the room shifted. The pressing quality of it lifted, just enough, like a barometric change before rain. Around the hall, the kneeling wolves released a collective breath. No one stood. No one spoke. But the air moved differently. Halric placed his hand briefly over hers where it rested on his arm. Just a moment. Just the weight of acknowledgement. And then he turned them both toward the broken doors at the end of the aisle. They walked. The hall remained silent as they moved down the center aisle, past 200 wolves who watched without a word, past the silk ribbons and the silver lanterns, or past the altar with its green cloth and its ceremonial blade, past Aldrich, who sat very still and did not look at either of them, past Soraya, who had not moved from where she had settled in her silk gown, and whose face was unreadable. The two great doors lay flat on the stone floor, their iron hinges split cleanly from the walls. Cold Highland air moved in through the opening they had left, carrying the smell of pine and rain on its way. Celine walked through it without looking back. Two black vehicles waited on the gravel drive. A man stood beside the first one, lean, watchful, his stillness the professional kind, the kind that means the mind behind it is moving very quickly. He had dark eyes and a careful face, and the particular quality of someone who has spent years in proximity to power and learned to take up exactly the space he needed, and no more. Valen Frosthaven. She would learn his name later. At that moment, she only noted him the way she noted all things that appeared in significant spaces, quietly, thoroughly, filing the details away. Halric opened the car door himself. She got in. They pulled off the gravel drive and onto the mountain road. The pack house shrank in the rear window, the pine trees on either side of the road moving past in the grey late afternoon light, the territory she had spent 6 years rebuilding, disappearing steadily behind them. She watched the trees. After a long stretch of silence, and something surfaced in her, a thought she had been holding back with both hands since the moment the doors came down, a practical concern dressed up as detachment from the enormity of everything else. "The pack will struggle," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost to herself. "Without the forestry contracts, they won't know about the subsidiary registration. The Highland Authority won't renew without my signature, and there are 18 months of consolidated filings attached to those contracts that no one else knows how to navigate." Halric turned his head. He looked at her the way she had not expected to be looked at, not with impatience, not with surprise that she was already doing this, but with complete and genuine attention. "Tell me," he said. So she told him. For the next 40 minutes, as the vehicle wound down the mountain road through the darkening Highland evening, Celine explained the entire financial architecture of Iron Vale Forestry, the subsidiary, the contract structure, the Highland Authority relationship she had built over 6 years of careful quarterly meetings and consistent delivery on every commitment made. The 3-year renewable cycle and where it currently sat, the outstanding debt she had restructured, the operating reserves, the payroll dependencies, the emergency maintenance fund for the Border Patrol equipment. She told him all of it with the calm, precise fluency of someone who had built every part of it and could reproduce it from memory in her sleep. He listened without interrupting once. When she finished, not the mountain road had leveled out, and the pines had given way to the lower valley terrain. The sky was a deep, clear grey. The first stars were coming out. "You saved them," Halric said, "even on your way out the door." Celine looked at the darkening valley through the window. "The people in the pack didn't make the decisions that created this situation," she said. "Brenner Greystone needs his heart medication on Thursdays. Islin Briarwell needs the medical supply contract maintained. The children in the schooling program didn't ask to have their futures dependent on whether the adults around them were behaving reasonably." A pause. "The pack is not Aldrich. It was never only Aldrich." Silence. Then Halric quietly. "No, it was largely you." She did not respond to that. But something in her chest did. Something small and careful, and warmly uncertain, and she did not close the window on it the way she usually would have. She left it open, just a little, and let the night air in. She had expected cold grandeur. Some part of her, the part that dealt in expectations and contingency planning and preferred not to be surprised by environments, had constructed a working image of Thornfield Estate over the drive, vast, formal, immaculate in the way that powerful places sometimes are, which is to say, immaculate in a way that feels slightly hostile. Grand rooms, long corridors, the kind of beauty that is mostly designed to be impressive rather than inhabited. She was wrong. Thornfield Estate was built into the mountainside, a vast, modern compound that seemed to have grown from the rock rather than been placed on it, art all clean stone and warm amber lighting and floor-to-ceiling glass on the southern face that framed the valley below in the last of the evening light. It ran with the precision of a military operation, security rotations, supply deliveries, staff movements. Everything timed and purposeful and remarkably quiet. But threaded through all of that efficiency was something she had not expected. Warmth. The kind that lives in the details. In the books on the sitting room shelves that were clearly read, not decorative. In the kitchen that smelled of something actually cooking. In the way the staff moved through the space with the ease of people who are trusted to do their work well and given the conditions to do so. It was powerful without being cruel. Valen Frosthaven met them at the entry. He was, she discovered in those first few minutes, or the kind of man who absorbed information about new arrivals in the room with the unhurried efficiency of long professional habit, noting her posture, her gaze pattern, the direction her eyes moved first when she crossed a threshold. He was good at it. She was better at noticing people who were good at it. She had been in the entryway for perhaps 45 seconds when she registered the gap in the northwest security rotation, a 12-minute window between the patrol changeover and the motion sensor reset on the upper approach. It was probably intentional. A calculated gap kept consistent because changing it too frequently created predictability of a different kind. But it was worth asking. She didn't ask. Not yet. Valen watched her from his position near the door. Then he turned to the assistant beside him and said, at normal volume, with no particular inflection. "She's already cataloguing the security gaps." The assistant looked faintly alarmed. Valen did not elaborate. He said it the way a mechanic notes that the new arrival clearly knows how an engine works, with the mild recognition of one professional encountering another. Halric showed her to her rooms himself. The rooms were on the east wing, A sitting area with the same floor-to-ceiling glass as the rest of the estate, a small private study with an actual desk and real reading light, a bedroom that faced the mountain's upper slope. She stood in the doorway of the sitting area and looked at the desk and the shelves and the view, and something in the careful tension of the past 3 weeks quietly shifted, just slightly. "What, you are not here as a guest who is obligated to perform gratitude," Halric said. He stood in the doorway behind her, his voice matter-of-fact, as though he had calculated that this was the thing she most needed to hear first. "You are not here in any capacity that requires anything of you. No meetings, no functions, no role. Nothing until you want there to be something." She turned to look at him. "Rest," he said simply. "For as long as it takes." She studied his face. There was no second layer to the offer. No expectation dressed in generosity. No invitation she was meant to feel the pressure of. He meant exactly what he said, and he was at ease enough with himself not to need anything back from it. She found, unexpectedly, that this was more comforting than any elaborate expression of care would have been. "Thank you," she said. "Good night, Celine." She slept for 11 hours. She woke before dawn, as she always did, her internal clock unaffected by events. The estate was just beginning to stir. Kitchen sounds from somewhere below, the early security rotation moving past the window. She lay in the unfamiliar room and listened to it, and for a few minutes she did not try to organize her thoughts or make any kind of plan. She simply listened. Then her mind started anyway, because it always did. She dressed. She went to the sitting room. She asked the early staff member who arrived with a tray of coffee whether there was something she could read, reports, filings, anything with numbers. The young man blinked at her for a moment. Then he went away and came back with a bound copy of the most recent quarterly reports for Thornfield Global, at the estate's primary operating entity. She settled at the desk with the reports and her coffee. 2 hours later, she had found the structural inefficiency in the Northern Logistics contracts. It was not buried exactly. It was simply not being looked at from the right angle. The contracts had been renewed on auto-escalation for 3 consecutive cycles, which was standard practice, but the escalation rate had been benchmarked against a regional index that no longer reflected the actual operational costs in the Northern Corridor. The result was a systematic overpayment on 4 separate service contracts that had been absorbing roughly 4% of the Northern Logistics budget quarterly. 4% per quarter, compounding across 3 years. It was not a small number. No, she was making a second cup of coffee when Halric appeared in the doorway. He was dressed, but not formally, the kind of morning clothing that belongs to a man in his own house, carrying his own coffee, looking like someone who had been awake for a while and was comfortable with the quiet of early hours. He looked at her desk, at the open quarterly reports, at the notes she had made in the margins of the loose sheets she had borrowed from the side table. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. "Your Northern Logistics contracts are overpaying by approximately 4% quarterly," she said. "The benchmarking index they were last reviewed against is outdated. You'll want to rebid those 4 contracts at current market rates before the next renewal cycle, or switch the escalation benchmark to the current regional freight index, whichever your operations team prefers." He sat down across from her. He looked at her notes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and genuine, startled out of him with the ease of someone who does not laugh for effect. It filled the room in a way that was entirely different from his professional presence, lighter and more human, and Celine looked at him across the desk with an expression of mild surprise that she did not fully manage to conceal. "My Northern Operations advisor has been looking at those contracts for 2 months, he said. He mentioned a possible inefficiency in passing, in approximately those terms. He has not found the source. "He is looking at the wrong column," Celine said. The escalation rate is in the appendix. Most people check the base rate. Halric looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. His expression was something she did not immediately have a name for. Not admiration, exactly, though it was adjacent to that. Something more specific. Something that looked like the quiet attention of a person who has waited a long time for a particular kind of conversation and has just been surprised to find it here in the early morning, over quarterly reports and borrowed notepaper. "My advisors," he said slowly, "are too comfortable." "Yes," she said. "They are." A small silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind that belongs between two people who are both, privately, taking note of a dynamic they are not yet ready to name. Days passed. Then more days. She moved through Thornfield Estate with the careful attention of someone mapping new territory. She learned its rhythms, the security rotation schedule, the kitchen's operating calendar, the weekly pattern of staff meetings and briefings that kept the estate's considerable operations running. She asked questions when she had them. She offered observations when they seemed useful. She declined to attend the formal functions that began presenting themselves on her calendar after the first week, and when Halric checked in, briefly, without pressure, she told him she would attend the ones she thought she should, once she had a better sense of what they required. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She noticed that he never pushed. On the 8th evening, she was standing at the glass wall of the sitting room, at the private lake below catching the last of the day's light, her empty coffee cup held loosely in one hand. The mountains behind the estate were turning the particular dark blue that belongs to highland evenings just before the stars appear. She had been thinking, in a scattered, unfocused way, about the week and what had been accomplished in it, and what remained. She heard the door and turned. Halric came in. He had been in meetings all day. She had heard voices in the East Wing conference rooms, a steady, purposeful traffic of advisors and couriers and regional emissaries. He looked like a man who had spent 8 hours carrying considerable responsibility and was not broken by it, but was genuinely glad for it to be over for the day. He crossed the room without ceremony and stood beside her at the glass wall, as they looked at the lake together. After a while, he said, "What do you miss about mornings at Iron Vale?" She considered the question honestly. "The quiet before anyone else was awake," she said. "And the coffee, actually. The local blend from the village supplier was very good. I never found an equivalent from a larger company. I'll have someone look into the supplier." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She looked at him. He was watching the lake with the easy, unhurried manner of someone comfortable with their own company, and she realized she was comfortable with his, in a way that was distinct from the professional ease she felt in organized environments, different in its quality, warmer in some way she had not yet properly examined. "Have you ever cooked a meal?" she asked. He turned. There was a brief, telling hesitation. "That depends entirely," he said carefully, "on how broadly you are defining the term." She laughed. It came out before she had any chance to consider it. A real laugh, quick and surprised, pulled from her by the precise comedic timing of his answer and the complete sincerity with which he delivered it. It lasted only a moment before she recovered her composure. But it happened, fully and genuinely, and it was the first time in weeks that anything in her had moved like that. Halric did not make a show of it. He did not draw attention to it or comment on it. He just smiled, private and quiet, like someone noting a detail they intended to remember, and kept talking. They stayed at the glass wall until the stars came out. Later, at the door of the sitting room, she paused before leaving. She did not turn around. "But why did you come?" she said. "Truly, you did not know me." A silence, long enough to be considered, short enough not to feel rehearsed. "I knew what losing you felt like from 300 miles away," he said. That was enough. She went to her room. She lay in the dark with that sentence sitting in her chest, steady and warm and quietly persistent, the way an ember sits in ash long after the fire has been banked. And she did not try to analyze it, or organize it, or reduce it to something manageable. She simply let it be there, and she let herself feel it. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the forestry contracts lapsed. It happened on a Wednesday, at midnight, when the rolling extension that had been keeping the Highland Authority filings technically active finally ran out. As the authority sent formal notification to Iron Vale Forestry at 9 the following morning. The contracts had entered suspension pending renewal application. A renewal application required the signature of the registered entity holder. The registered entity holder was Celine Dornmere, currently of Thornfield Estate. Aldrich read the notification in the administrative office. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and sat for a long time with his hands flat on the tabletop and his eyes on the wall. He had not known about the subsidiary. No one in Iron Vale had known about the subsidiary. No one except Elder Leoric, who had been briefed on it 6 years ago during the initial debt restructuring, and had nodded at the time with the expression of a man who understood exactly why it existed and intended to think about its implications carefully, and then had apparently decided that thinking about it carefully meant keeping it in a private corner of his mind and not examining it until it became relevant. It was now relevant. Celine had registered the subsidiary during the debt restructuring for entirely legitimate reasons, to protect the PAC's primary operating contracts from a possible hostile acquisition attempt by a regional land management company that had been circling Iron Vale's territory during its weakest financial period. She had structured the ownership so that, in the event of an external takeover bid, the contracts could not be seized as PAC assets because they were held by a separate legal entity. She had never imagined she would one day be the one who left. The PAC's primary revenue stream was now suspended. The Treasury, already running lean from the costs of the ceremony preparations and Soraya's redecorating expenditures in the weeks prior, had approximately 8 weeks of operating reserves at current spending levels. The payroll for the Border Patrol crews was due in 11 days. The medical supply order that kept Brenna Greystone's Thursday medication on schedule was on a net 30 payment contract with the pharmacy, and the pharmacy had already sent one courtesy reminder. Soraya was not taking this well. She had arrived at Iron Vale under the impression, not entirely unreasonable, but given her background, that a lunar position came with a certain standard of life that was simply part of the role. The meals, the space, the staff attention, the quality of the daily environment. She had not connected these things to the quiet, systematic work that had produced and maintained them. She had arrived after that work was already done, and she had taken the results of it for granted, the way people take for granted the structures that support them before they've ever had to build one themselves. Now the structures were showing their seams. She complained. Not maliciously. She complained with the genuine bewilderment of someone who did not understand how a situation she had not caused had become a problem she was expected to manage. She did not attend the emergency PAC meeting Aldrich called at the end of the first week. She said the atmosphere at PAC meetings made her uncomfortable. She ordered a delivery from the capital city at the end of the second week, items she said she needed to feel comfortable in the northern climate, and the PAC treasurer had to quietly set the charge aside as a pending question because there were no funds to clear it. Aldrich watched all of this with the stunned, particular silence of a man watching the floor of his life open up to reveal how much had been holding it up. He sat in the administrative office on a Tuesday afternoon, alone, with the contract notification in front of him and Celine's handwriting in the margins of every binder on the shelf behind him. Her notes were specific, dated, linked to subsequent documents with small annotation codes she had invented to make the filing system navigate faster. He pulled out the green binder, the Eastern Border Patrol rotation schedule. Her note was right there on the first page, in the neat handwriting he had seen every day for 6 years, without, apparently, truly reading it. Do not change the winter rotation. The younger wolves push past safe limits in the cold. The current schedule compensates for this. Trust it. He closed the binder. He had assumed, in the comfortable, unexamined way of someone who has been well supported for a long time, that the pack's stability was a feature of the territory, something that existed naturally, that would persist once the circumstances changed. He had not asked himself, not once, what would remain when the person who generated that stability was gone. He understood now, sitting in the cold office with the notification on the desk and the winter light coming through the small high windows with the precision and the weight that only real consequences can deliver, exactly how wrong he had been. The courier arrived at Ironvale on a Thursday morning. He carried a thick envelope marked with the header of Dawnmere Holdings, a company name none of them had encountered before, but whose legal documentation, when Elder Leoric spread it across the meeting room table, was impeccably organized and entirely legitimate. The Dawnmere Holdings proposal was not a punishment. This was the first thing Leoric said when he gathered the senior pack members, and he said it clearly and firmly, because he wanted it understood before anyone had the chance to feel otherwise. The terms were fair, precise and fair, which was, but if you knew Selene at all, exactly what you would have expected. Dawnmere Holdings would assume all of Ironvale's outstanding contracted debts. It would pay the overdue land taxes, including the 3 years of partial payments that had been quietly accumulating at the back of the Treasury records. It would secure the forestry contracts through a renewed application under the Dawnmere Holdings subsidiary, and it would guarantee those contracts for a minimum of 10 years. In return, all operational and financial authority over Ironvale Forestry would transfer to a trust administered by Elder Leoric Holloway for the exclusive benefit of the pack's members. Aldrich Coldridge would retain his title as Alpha. He would receive a standard member stipend, equal to every other wolf in the territory, no more. The meeting room was very quiet when Leoric finished reading. Islin Briarwell sat at the far end of the table. She had the document in front of her, the version addressed specifically to the healer's cottage, outlining the continued medical supply contract and the designated fund for specialist care of elderly members. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. Selene was still saving them, after everything. Still quietly, precisely, making sure no one who depended on the pack was abandoned by the mistakes of the people leading it. Aldrich signed the documents the following Tuesday. He signed them alone, in the administrative office, at the desk that had been hers for 6 years. He did not call anyone in to witness it, beyond the notary the documents required. He picked up the pen and he held it for a moment, and he thought, without meaning to, without being able to stop it, about a night 3 years ago, when he had fallen asleep in his chair, mid-conversation, and he had woken in the morning to find his jacket draped over his shoulders and the completed survey reconciliation on his side of the desk. He had assumed, at the time, that it was simply how she worked. He understood now what it actually was. He signed his name. He set the pen down. He sat for a long time afterward in the quiet office, with her handwriting in the margins of every binder on the shelf, and the winter light coming through the windows, and the silence of a room from which all the working warmth had finally, officially, permanently gone. Soraya left on a Tuesday. 2 suitcases by the front door before anyone else was awake. A car arranged the previous evening. She came to find Aldrich in the kitchen, where he was standing with a cup of tea and the look of a man who had slept very little, and she stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat already on and told him she was sorry. She had tried. The bond was real. She was not pretending otherwise, and she did not want him to think she was. But this life was not the one she had been built for. The north was too cold, and the work was too constant, and she had been trying for weeks to feel like she belonged to it, and the feeling would not come. She said it gently. She meant every word. He nodded. He said he understood. She left. He stood on the front steps and watched the car go down the gravel drive until it turned onto the mountain road and disappeared into the pines. The morning was very cold. The ironwood tree in the courtyard had lost most of its leaves. He thought about the fact that she had planted it. He thought about the fact that she had gone to the nursery herself and come back with a sapling, and knelt in the cold spring soil beside him, without once making it into anything more than a practical act of improvement. He had never thought to ask what it meant to her. He had simply accepted it, the way he had accepted everything she gave, quietly, completely, and without examining the cost. He went inside. He had work to do. There was always work to do. And now, for the first time in 6 years, he was the one who would have to do all of it himself. 6 months after the ceremony, Thornfield Estate prepared for the winter gathering. It was the most significant event on the Northern Pack calendar, the one occasion each year when alphas, lunas, senior emissaries, and their closest advisers gathered under a single roof to conduct the year's most consequential political conversations, renew regional alliances, and settle the territorial agreements that would hold until the following winter. Over 300 wolves from across the northern and central territories. 3 days of formal sessions, informal negotiations, shared meals, and the kind of precise, layered social maneuvering that required equal parts intelligence, composure, and a very accurate read of the room at any given moment. Celine had been to gatherings before. She had attended 2 as Iron Vale's de facto operational representative, in the years when Aldrich had brought her along to manage the logistics and the financial documentation while he handled the formal relations. She had sat at the side of those rooms and watched the dynamics and filed away what she observed. She was not sitting at the side this time. The estate transformed in the week before the gathering. Staff arrived from additional properties. Security doubled. The great hall on the north wing was opened and prepared, a different space entirely from the hall at Iron Vale. Higher ceilings, longer walls, windows that filled an entire side of the room with the mountain view. The same warm amber lighting, but more of it. Tables set with the understated precision of people who understand that true elegance does not announce itself. On the first evening, Celine stood in front of the mirror in her rooms, where she wore deep midnight blue, a dress she had chosen without spending much time on the choosing, because it suited her, and she knew it, and that was sufficient. She did not wear ceremony adornments. She did not perform anything. She looked at herself steadily, the way she always looked at things that needed to be honestly assessed, and decided that she was ready. She was not the same woman who had stood at the back of the hall at Iron Vale in a simple black dress and spoken severance words in a clear, steady voice. The shape of her was the same. The composure was the same. But something underneath it had changed. Something had settled and opened and found a different arrangement. Quieter in some places, considerably less quiet in others. She went to meet Ulrich in the main corridor. He was waiting for her outside the hall entrance, dressed in charcoal and deep grey, which suited him with the same effortlessness that everything seemed to suit him. Not because the clothes were exceptional, but because he wore them without thinking about them, all his attention directed outward, towards the things that mattered. He looked at her when she approached, and something moved briefly in his expression, warm and direct and entirely genuine, before it settled back into the composed authority he wore for public rooms. He offered his arm. She took it, the way she had once before in the hall at Iron Vale, but differently. Not as an escape, not as a last option, as a choice, freely made, in the full knowledge of what it was. They walked into the hall together. The room bowed. Not dramatically, not all at once. But the awareness moved through the assembled wolves in a wave, heads lowering in respect as they passed, conversation pausing and resuming in their wake. Selene felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, and let it move through her without resisting it. Halric's aura walked beside her, like something she had learned to translate. Not pressure anymore, but language. A language she was beginning to understand, and to be part of. She had been in the gathering for perhaps 90 minutes, moving through the room in the deliberate, unhurried way of someone who is comfortable with their own pace when she heard the remark. It came from a cluster of alphas near the eastern wall. 4 men in formal dress, one of them speaking at a volume calculated to reach slightly beyond his immediate circle. She knew the voice before she placed the face. It was Alpha Orson Greystone of the Coldridge Western Territories, a thick-set man with a political profile built on strategic alliances and the consistent cultivation of slightly smaller rivals. He had been circling Halric's northern agreements for 2 years, with the careful patience of a man who believed that patience was the most undervalued currency in pack politics. He was, she noted, not as patient as he thought he was. What he said, at that just above conversational volume, in that tone of performed amusement that always reveals far more about the speaker than the target, was this: that one heard the new queen had arrived at Thornfield direct from an administrative position in a minor northern pack, and one wondered whether the accounting skills she had apparently applied to someone else's territory had been what secured her current position, or whether Halric Thornfield had simply decided that managing expenses was a more compelling quality than breeding. The cluster around him laughed, quietly, with the careful laughter of men calculating how far it was safe to go. The room tightened. Near the western wall, Valen Frosthaven went very still. Beside Selene, Halric's hand came to rest flat against his own side, a small, controlled movement that was the only visible evidence of what was happening under the surface. Selene rested one hand lightly on his arm, just rested it there. A moment of contact, brief and precise, that said, "I have this." She turned toward the eastern wall. She crossed the distance between herself and Orson Greystone without hurrying, and she stopped at the edge of his circle, and she looked at him with an expression of complete pleasantness. "Alpha Greystone," she said. He turned. He was still wearing his performance smile, the practiced, slightly superior expression of a man who has delivered a line and is waiting to see how it lands. He looked at her with the easy confidence of someone who expects the room to remain arranged in his favor. "I am familiar with the Coldridge territorial lease agreements," she said, in the same conversational tone she used for everything that mattered. "Specifically, I've reviewed the 4 active operating leases your pack holds through the Northern Highland Authority. 2 of them are in the standard renewal cycle, coming up in the next quarter, I believe." Orson's smile did not disappear, but something in it changed. A slight shift in the quality of his attention, the way a man's expression changes when he realizes the conversation has moved onto ground he was not prepared for. "I joined the Northern Highland Authority Review Board 6 weeks ago," Selene continued. Her voice remained entirely pleasant. "I will be one of the 3 reviewers on your renewal application." A silence. Not just from the cluster around Orson, from the nearby tables, where the nearby conversations had quietly stilled, from the space along the eastern wall, where several senior emissaries had apparently developed a sudden interest in the architectural details of the room. She looked at Orson Greystone with the steady, almost open expression of someone who has put a fact on the table and is waiting to see what the other party does with it. "I would suggest," she said, "that you choose your next words as carefully as your pack's territorial stability depends on them." The silence stretched. Orson Greystone looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. Then he looked back at her. He lowered his head. Not deeply, but genuinely. "I spoke carelessly," he said. "I apologize." She nodded once, pleasantly, and turned away. Halric was 3 steps behind her. He said nothing. He did not need to. When she turned back to him, she found him watching her with an expression that she had never seen on any face directed at her before. Not admiration in the public sense, not the performative pride of an alpha watching his partner succeed in a political room, and something quieter and more private. The particular expression of a person watching something they have been waiting a long time to find, and experiencing in real time the full understanding of what they have. It looked, she thought, like wonder. He did not speak. He simply looked at her with that expression for a long, unhurried moment. And then he reached out and took her hand. Here, in this room, in front of 300 wolves, without ceremony or announcement or any of the formality that typically surrounded significant acts in their world. He just took her hand. She looked at their joined hands. She looked up at him. Something that had been held very carefully in place for a long time. Some last layer of careful distance. And the one she had maintained, not out of distrust, but out of the practiced habit of a person who had learned not to lean too fully in case the support gave way, simply released, quietly, completely, without drama. He leaned forward and kissed her, not for the room, not as a statement or a claim or a political gesture, simply because he could no longer think of a single reasonable argument against it. And when the mate bond sealed, the warmth spreading from the base of her neck outward in a single slow, irresistible wave, filling her chest and settling into the bones of her hands and the backs of her knees, it did not feel like a new thing imposed on her. It felt like a confirmation of something that had already been true, like the word for a feeling she had had for months, but had not yet found the language for, landing quietly and completely into place. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she opened them. She was still in the hall. 300 wolves were watching. The mountains were visible through the tall windows in the late winter dark, and she was standing, entirely freely and entirely willingly, exactly where she was. The return to Ironvale came 2 weeks later, a grey morning in early winter, the kind where the clouds are low and flat, and the air has that particular, clean weight that comes just before the first heavy snow of the season. She arrived with Varlin and 1 administrative assistant in a single vehicle, carrying the operational handover documents that needed Elder Leoric's countersignature to finalize the trust administration arrangement. She had not been back since the night of the ceremony, but the pack house looked different in the winter light, quieter. The decorative garden feature by the healer's cottage path had been removed, the original drainage channels restored, she noted, not perfectly, but close enough. Someone had tried. The pale chairs in the common room were still visible through the window, already showing the marks of a northern winter season. But the building itself was the same stone, the same slate roof, the same ironwood tree in the courtyard standing bare and patient in the cold air. Elder Leoric met her at the door. He took her hand in both of his. He did not say anything for a moment. "Good to see you with colour in your face," he said finally. "Good to see the Eastern Patrol rotation hasn't been changed," she said. He smiled, dry and warm and entirely himself. "It has not," he said. I made sure of it." They went inside to work. The documents took 40 minutes. Leoric had read everything in advance and had 4 precise questions, each of them relevant and none of them difficult. Islin Briarwell stopped in briefly, found Celine at the meeting room table, and stood in the doorway for a moment, with her hand pressed to her own sternum, and her eyes bright. "You look well," Islin said. "I am well," Celine said. Islin nodded once, as though this was being filed and would not require elaboration. She disappeared back toward the healer's cottage. She was gathering her coat to leave when she found Aldrich on the front steps. She had known she would. She had been aware of his presence in the pack house during the whole of her time inside it, the quiet awareness of a wolf in familiar territory, or noting the location of other wolves the way the body notes weather, without thought. He had not come into the meeting room. He had not sent word. He had simply been somewhere in the building, and now he was here. He looked older, not dramatically, not in any way someone who didn't know him would notice, but she knew him, and she could see it. The weight he was carrying now was different from the grief he had arrived with 6 years ago. That had been the weight of inherited failure. This was the weight of understanding, the particular heaviness of a man who has seen clearly what he had and what he did with it, and is going to have to carry that clarity for the rest of his life. He did not speak immediately. He stood on the steps in the cold morning air and looked at her with an expression that had been stripped of everything except the admission at its center. "Celine," he said. That was all he said. She looked at him. She took a slow, honest inventory of what was in her own chest. She searched carefully, for grief, for anger, for the particular tender ache she had carried through 6 years of loving someone who had not quite seen her. She looked for any of it. She found a clean, still quiet, not emptiness, not numbness, something that was actually the absence of pain, genuine and earned and complete, the difference between an absence and a healing. "The accounts will be reviewed quarterly by Elder Leoric," she said. "The Eastern Border Patrol rotation schedule is in the green binder on the 3rd shelf. Do not change it in winter. The younger wolves push too hard in the cold, and the current schedule compensates for that." A pause. "Brenna Greystone's medication goes out on Thursdays. The pharmacy holds the order until noon, not until closing. Someone needs to go before noon." Aldrich nodded slowly. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Nothing unsaid remained between them. There was nothing left to leave, and nothing left to take. She walked inside to collect Valen and her assistant. An hour later, she walked back out into the highland morning. The clouds had broken in a single place, directly above the courtyard, a long gap in the grey that let through one shaft of pale winter sunlight, tilted at the exact angle that caught the bare branches of the ironwood tree and turned them briefly, improbably, gold. The whole courtyard was quiet. The snow had not fallen yet, but it was coming. She could smell it in the air, that cold, clean, mineral smell that belonged to northern winters and to nowhere else. She stood for a moment. She looked at the tree. Then she walked across the courtyard and through the main gate, where Valen was already waiting by the vehicle, and where Halric was standing beside it. Because of course he was there. Because of course he had driven the hour up the mountain road on a grey winter morning, without being asked, without announcement, the way people show up for the things they have decided matter to them. He said nothing when she came through the gate. He simply opened the car door, and the way he looked at her, steady, warm, entirely and unhesitatingly certain, was the only thing she needed, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise. She walked toward him. She did not look back. The ironwood tree stood in the cold courtyard behind her, its branches golden for a moment in the break of winter light. Then the clouds shifted. The light moved on. The tree remained, patient as stone, rooted as everything real, already budding, if you looked closely enough, for the season ahead.